What is up, my Shadowverse soldiers, and welcome back to another Shadowverse Evolved video. Alright, so it was a beautiful Saturday morning at the time of recording, and I want to say good luck to everybody that is going to the Grand Showdown this weekend. I hope everybody does very well. Make sure you breathe and think about your plays before you actually do them, because, one false mistake could definitely be your last, because that's how it works up there. So, good luck to everybody going to Grand Showdown, and let's go ahead and get into this. But in today's video, we're going to be doing the set 6 tier list. I know in the last tier list we might have missed a couple of decks, or I might in general might miss decks here too. So if I did miss any decks that you guys might know about and I don't know about at all and just completely missed them, let me know down below in the comments below, and I'll put them either in the next one for the Cinderella Girls or in set 7, whatever I can fit it in. But without a further ado, before we get into this tier list, let's go ahead and take a peek at last time's tier list for set 5. Alright, so this is the tier list that we did for last set. Everything looks pretty placed, and I think everything was just really fairly sorted. Outside of that, some of the images for the legendaries for certain decks will definitely look different in this tier list, because these new legendaries really bring the archetype together and make it a little bit stronger. So I'm going to give you guys a PSA if you see any images looking different for those certain decks in this video. Alright, so getting into this tier list, so we have another wave of Shadowverse Evolved. It makes me very excited to go ahead and rank these decks, because sometimes when we have new cards coming out in each different set, it might upgrade our older decks, or we have a new archetype to look at. Lots and lots of stuff to talk about these different decks, and grading them from either the worst or to the best tiers of these archetypes and decks. Alright, and without further ado, let's go ahead and start this list off with Ramp Dragon. So Ramp Dragon is one of those decks where you have to be very cautious. That Forte is going to be a card that's going to be slapped down and going to swing 7 at you. Well, we are no longer in a meta where, okay, Forte is the scariest card in the meta, and that's not going to be something anyone's worried about, because we all now have ways to either heal ourselves or to go ahead and stop other boss monsters from happening, or we can have a follower that's gonna rush into Forte and get some sort of advantage from either being played or being rushed into her and then dying. So I'm going to put this deck in tier 2. I think it's a pretty solid deck. Will it win anything? I'm not sure. If it does, it'll definitely be like from under the rug from everybody talking about these new meta decks right now. But I think Ramp Dragon is still viable, so if you want to play that, then go ahead and play it. And the next deck we will be looking at is Academic. So the Academic deck is pretty good. I would say that it's pretty solid. It definitely got a new follower that makes these Academic followers cost 1 less. So when you get into turn 4, you might have like some extra play points for maybe either an Angelic Snipe or Lamplet. Something, because you'll need something to survive those early game decks that are going to be rushing you down while you're not really doing anything. Now, as far as where I would rank it, I would say that this deck is a tier 3 deck. It's pretty solid. Now, it might be able to win like a shop championship, like a BCS or something like that, but if you take this deck to Grand Showdown, you better really show out and know how these matchups go, because you're going to be in an uphill fight. But personally, I would say it's tier 3. Not really necessarily keep this at locals, but if you're going to go to like a shop championship and you want to bring this, then this is something roguey that you can definitely win with and get somebody's like highlights of, hey, I did this, I was able to pull off Academics. But we're going to need some more support for it to finally reach those tiers of like tier 2, tier 1.5 and stuff like that. But, we're hopeful for the future, because Shadowverse Evolved is definitely breathing more life into the air. Alright, so following up, we have Aggro Abyss. So Aggro Abyss is very good right now. I think it's very clean to play. It's very easy to pilot. You just have to make sure that you get the right hand, and if your opponent doesn't have the answer for your stuff, then, you're really going to be in a good position. So in terms of where I would rank this deck, it would definitely be in the top 3 spots for sure. But what we would really rate it, I would say 1.5. It has some really strong things going for it, but with the control sort of aspect that we're going to be in for this meta, in my opinion, I think this deck will have to have a really good hand, and your opponent does not need to see what they have to see, or you need to use your stuff early. Make sure you get all that early BS out of their hand, and then you have to make sure they don't have anything for your mid game when you start swinging with your bigger monsters. Alright, so it might be a little hot takey of me to say, but I do believe that this deck is tier 1 when your opponent doesn't have like a really good hand and they're not doing anything for 3 turns, and you have like a god tier hand. Tier 1 deck for sure. Definitely can get under your opponent. But tier 1.5, it's like, it can get there. It can definitely get there in terms of what the new stuff that it has. But honestly, it's a tier 1.5 to just play it on the safe side. All right, and next up we have Hand Control Abyss, Silence Abyss, whatever you want to call it. It is still going, Azazel's still going to be the representation of it, just because Azazel's always going to be in the list. Because if you're going up against a build that, you know, heals past a certain amount where you can't really deal as much damage, you should already know Azazel's going to be your MVP there. Now, if you don't already know, any aspect of the control version, Silence Abyss Hand Control will be of tier 1, just because you're going to be sniping random cards out of your opponent's hand. Sometimes there's a good control on it because you can snipe their win con, and sometimes there's bad where you just, you know, you're going against Kuan or something and you hit a spell card and you're like, okay, well, you did the easy thing for me. Like, you made the easy choice for me. Like, I didn't honestly need it in my hand. It would have helped to use it against you, but it being in the cemetery isn't, you know, like the end of the world. Alrighty, and next up we have Earthright. So Earthright has definitely came out with some pretty neat cards that can help us, with Hulking Giant just having a fanfare ability of dealing 5 damage to a follower. Now you don't have to really, you know, commit for spells like Witch Bolt and stuff like that. You'll probably still need that for the early game, you know, just to spend 3 and get rid of a follower that your opponent might play that might be on 3 and have 5 defense. But now we have it in the form of a Golem follower, which also helps with Ancient Alchemist. And if I didn't already say, Mirror of Truth is a very good card to think about too, especially if they get your Ancient Alchemist. If they don't banish it, of course, but if they get one of your Ancient Alchemists off the field and you didn't really get to evolve it just because you wanted to, you know, play it on 3 and see what your opponent would do. So Mirror of Truth is a very good card to be playing too. Now, as far as ranking Earthright, I would say that this deck is tier 2. It has some very solid things that came out this set for it. We have a board wipe in terms of a spell card that we can just go ahead and get rid of a Golem follower, which, you know, there are other Golem followers that have last words effects. So it's pretty cool that we have that combination now. Alright, and next up we have Vampires. So Vampires isn't anything too crazy. It got 2 new cards this set. Has the little succubus that summons a forest bat when it's played, and then when it dies you summon another forest bat, which is cool because, you know, you can use soul conversion with stuff like that. And then they have that new spell card, but I don't think those cards are going to save the deck because there are cards like Limaga that really, you know, saved Hunter Forest from last set. So we're gonna put it and bring this mess to locals until it finally has some sort of support that can really, you know, push it over the edge, maybe into tier 3 where it has like a strong little boss monster that can do X amount of things with vampires or something like that. But when we get there, we'll finally be there. But for right now, this deck is at bring this to locals. Alrighty, and next up we have Discard Dragon. So this deck definitely is going to fall. I think we had it at tier 1.5 or tier 1 now. I can't remember where I had it in the last list. We just looked at it, but I know right now this deck is not doing too well because we have our tier 1 monster, Silence Abyss, where it's going to just literally destroy their hand. And I'm going to put it at tier 2. If you want to play this deck, feel free to, but it's very dangerous playing this deck in the format that we're transitioning into. Alrighty, and then we have Ghost Abyss. Nothing really more to talk about outside of putting it in needs more support because this deck is absolutely butt. But hopefully there'll be more Ghost followers that are introduced into the game, or more followers that can really help out that Ghost Abyss deck. But this deck definitely needs more support. Alright, so this next deck is going to be D-Shift without Kuan and stuff like that. If you're playing more of a budget runecraft or something like that, like you don't have the means in terms of getting Kuan, yes, it is the better version of D-Shift, but there are other versions of D-Shift where we can just use Flame Destroyer and stuff like that. But we can just go ahead and put that in tier 3. It's not as good as the other D-Shift deck. I think I put it in tier 2 last time, but it has definitely fallen in terms of power. So we're going to put it in tier 3 and we're going to leave it at that. Alrighty, and next up we have Heavenly Aegis Havencraft. So I think as Havencraft gets more sort of toys to remove your stuff with, I think this deck just gets a little bit better because it's easier for us to get into the Heavenly Aegis. But I think with all the other stuff that Haven's been doing, I think this card, or at least this deck, has taken a little bit of a backseat. So I still think it's a tier 2 deck if you're able to, you know, stop your opponent and get into this thing. But outside of that, if you don't have Heavenly Aegis or some sort of like backup plan, because, you know, we do have a card that now, or at least a deck that is now stealing cards out of your hand, and, you know, you really don't know what to do if you have to change your game plan around if they take your win con. So I'm definitely gonna put it in tier 2 because I think that's a solid spot for it. But I think as more removal comes into the game for Havencraft, this deck honestly just gets better. Alrighty, and next up we have Uma. So I personally rebuilt Uma just not too long ago, And I was thinking, you know, even though they unerrated or unlimited a whole bunch of things, I was like, okay, well, the deck didn't really pilot too well, but playing it at full power, I was like, okay, I'm hitting every card that I need to, and, you know, there are some cards that I don't even need. And if you play 7 more centimeters ahead, which you're able to, if you're playing against like Kuon or something like that, if they don't get that card, and even if they get the 7 more centimeters ahead, you can get it back with Agnes. So I think this deck is honestly 1.5. I think it can definitely hang. If you're a good Uma player, I would suggest playing it because it is still a deck that you still need to watch out for. So I'm going to put it into your 1.5. Alrighty, and next up we have Leviathan Dragon. So there's not really much to talk about this. This is a levels deck. If you have locals like every week, I would say, and you know, you can play for maybe a prizing, I think this is something you can take if you don't really want to like be pressed every week. This is definitely a deck that you can play and, you know, just mess around and have fun. You know, just be like, yeah, I went X4 with this deck, you know, it happens. But this is definitely a levels deck, and you know, I don't know too much about the archetype, but I know it's definitely not performing well. But no disrespect to any Leviathan Dragon players, because we love all archetypes here. I just know, just through, you know, hard facts, the deck is not performing too well. But moving on, let's talk about Egg Haven. Alright, so Egg Haven. So this deck is honestly still strong. It's the best version of Haven. That is very true. I will say that. I will say that, and I will stick to it. It is the best version of Haven. There is another archetype that counters Kuon, but it is not the best version of Haven, unfortunately. So Egg Haven is still strong. It can still hang. It still does what it needs to do, dealing damage to face and clearing your board. And if you're in a weird situation where you're like, okay, well, you know, I'm starting to top deck with Egg Haven, you're not in a good position because Egg Haven can get stuff out of their cemetery with the swiftness. Alrighty, and next up we have Spell Chain with Mithril Golem as our top end, and of course we do have the fact that there are new spell cards like Crimson Meteor Storm, which is a good Spell Chain card to have. So I have a hard time, I have like a hard time trying to place this deck because it's between tier 3 and bring this to locals. So with Spell Chain, of course, you know, Mithril Golem is going to be the top legendary. I can't think of any other Spell Chain besides Giant Chimera, but that deck is in like a whole nother realm in terms of what this deck does. So I think this deck can go in tier 3. I think this deck could go in tier 3. It could potentially hang. If D-Shift is in tier 3, I think Spell Chain without D-Shift can sit in tier 3 too. So you have your Runeblade Summoners. We now have Crimson Meteor Storm that can reduce the cost if you have Spell Chain 10. We still have Merlins, and then you run Agnes too, so you can stop those early game aggressions. So I think this deck is definitely tier 3, but the top end, you know, where you're trying to finish them off with whatever boss monster, well, we're looking at Mithril Golem, but Mithril Golem isn't too crazy, so it's definitely a tier 3 deck. Alright, so next up we have BNB Forest, and oh my, how the mighty have fallen. So this deck was the talk of the town when set 3 was rolling around. Of course, you know, Fables is just a good thing to play, honestly. It was a very easy mechanic for people to get into Shadowverse, and I think if you still want to get into Shadowverse Evolve, I think you should pick up a Fable deck, you know, either Haven or whatever craft that you might be interested in the version of Fable, just so you can learn the mechanic to Shadowverse Evolve, and then, you know, you can upgrade to whatever deck outside of that, because the game isn't too expensive. So, you know, just go ahead and have like a pet deck under your deck so you can teach it to new people. And so I think BNB is a very good deck to play. But however, Beauty and the Beast is definitely not as strong as it used to be in set 3 because we are in double those sets. So obviously if the deck hasn't gotten any power, it's definitely losing some. So I would say that this deck is a bring to locals. There is a way now for a dragon to get cards out of your EX area just from one card. I know that's just Dragon Tech, of course, but if you're focusing on putting all of your efforts into one card into your EX area, and you're not really helping yourself like get to a second game plan, yes, that card's out of, you know, some opponent's reach, but you have to realize that the cards aren't going to your hand, they're going to your EX area through Alice and stuff like that. So now I would say that this deck is bringing this to locals, and I don't really know what else to say about it because this deck terrorized me in set 3. And then next up we have chess. Dean, I saw your comment and on the set 5 tier list, and I love you. I love you. I love you. I know it was all jokes, but I'm gonna put this in needs more support. This deck needs some more support. Like I think everybody tries to make this deck work, especially like putting new things in it, like either like Lashena or, you know, if you put any sort of wacky thing. This deck just needs more support. Hopefully we'll get another big chess card in the future, but I feel like everybody gaining access to some sort of board wipe, it just makes this deck even worse, because when we put out the king, we just get board wiped, and then there you go. Like, we have to rebuild our board again. So chess will definitely stay and need more support until we get some more support for it. Alrighty, and next up we have Bounce Forest, which is Forest that's just bouncing cards back into their hand just to set up for like a Silverbolt or, you know, King Elephant. But we're just going to keep it at Witchbolt Forest, where it's not King Elephant as the top end. So I would definitely put this deck into tier 3. Forest is still very strong, especially with, you know, Tia and stuff like that, doing combos and everything. And then now, we already have Sukuna, but Sukuna is just another target for the bouncing mechanic to, you know, get to combo 5 and everything. But it is not the highlight of Forest this set, so I'm going to put it in tier 3. Alright, and next up we have Mid-Range Sword. So Courtly Dance is a very beautiful card that came out for Sword. If you want to rock that card and Courtly Dance at the same time, you know, by all means, go ahead. You'll be getting a lot more from Courtly Dance than playing Leonidas. Well, it depends on what deck you're going up against, but I still think it's a solid deck to be playing if you also want to play like a very, you know, tempo-y game of Sword. So I think this deck as a tier 2 deck is very strong. Leonidas's Resolve is still a force to be reckoned with. If you don't remove that token off the field, you're going to regret it if they start playing Storm followers and, you know, followers after that. Alrighty, and next up we have Hero Sword. So Hero Sword has definitely taken another backseat. Of course, you know, Mach Knight is still a good card, and the Ironwart Defender, I think that's the 1-cost follower too. Those cards you can still use because they're 1-cost 2/2s. And then we have Mach Knight for the fanfare of getting Storm if he's played from the deck, because we're still going to be using Heroic Entry 2 to get whatever Swordcraft follower they need from the top 4 that's 3 or less. But in terms of just the deck as an archetype, I would say that this deck is a tier 2 deck, just because we're not really using a Miro Spear Knight anymore to get a follower out of there. If you're still using it, by all means, feel free to. I still think the deck is very strong, but it is definitely taking a back seat in terms of what the top Sword deck could be. Alright, so next up we have Jabberwock Dragon. So Jabberwock with Garyu Dragon is pretty interesting. If you're able to make that work, feel free to. But in terms of like Jabberwock and what it can do in terms of a deck, I'd say it's locals level. There is a chance where Dragons is able to ramp as well as they do, and then get into Jabberwock very quickly, especially when you're doing Garyu, and then you do everything you do with Garyu, and then maybe follow up with a Jabberwock right after that. I feel like that'd be pretty interesting in terms of like what a deck can do. But in terms of what Jabberwock is entirely and what it is right now, I'd say it's a locals level deck. Alrighty, and next up we have Angels. Yeah, this needs some more support. It can work. It can work. These cards or these decks that are in needs more support. These decks can work, but they're just not strong. Like, they're not okay. They're not good. They're definitely in the hospital praying that they're going to, you know, like get out of that hospital bed. Those are what these decks are. They need more support is like, it's Lifeline. Like, they're sitting there flatlining and they're trying their best to survive. And that's definitely what, you know, Fallen Angels, Angels of Chaos, whatever you want to call this deck. It's definitely just hanging on by a thread. Alright, and next up we have Alana's Prayer. So if you're able to heal in your Haven deck, then I think this is not a bad card to consider. I don't think there's any decks that is like focusing around it. So I'm gonna put it in needs more support, especially right now. It's nothing too crazy to think about, but if your deck heals a whole bunch and you're able to get your followers to stick, by all means, this is definitely maybe like a tier 3, tier 2 deck if it really does pop off. But in terms of what it does all around, or what followers we have in terms to make Alana's Prayer happen, like if it happened twice in one turn, then maybe this deck is really like up there. But it only happens once every like one time you heal, and you have to make sure you play all your followers and make sure those followers don't have a fanfare of healing when they are played. So you have to really pay attention to what you're doing. So I think this deck really needs some more support to really get there. But moving on, we're going to be looking at Storm Haven. and I believe this deck is very strong. It has some good components. I think every time we get something that matters for either wards or for storm, then this deck gets a little bit better. But the new deck that came out that had a whole bunch of wards in it was Wilbert, and it didn't really help out this deck too much, so I will be putting it in tier 3. This is something that could potentially win like a BCS or something like that, but if you show up with at Grand Showdown, I hope you have a really good luck, you know, for future matches and stuff like that. But it really, like, if you don't have anything for late game, you know, what are you playing for early game? If you don't have anything for early game, what are you having for late game? Just, you know, those things you really have to decide when playing this deck. So you have to build it very carefully and shape it to however the meta is like holding up. All right, so moving on to the next deck, let's talk about Candelabra, Prayers, Heal, Amulet, Haven. So this deck is pretty nice. I'd say it has some very good solid healing for sure. Now, in terms of what it does, it feels pretty awkward when you already have 2 Candelabra Prayers out and then you play a Kaguya and you really want to play another Amulet out on the field. And you don't want that to proc, because when you do the Evo for Kaguya, you know, you're going to be playing an, you know, Ethereal Moon Amulet, which you're already going to be healing off that and dealing 3 damage or something. So I think Kaguya is really the big play for when it comes to this deck. You know, we do have Star Priestess that can, you know, banish one of the amulets on our field, and we can play one from our cemetery, which is nice. You can do some very good combos, and especially with the new spell card, we got even more stuff to play with. So in terms of what I would put this deck, I'd say it's tier 2. I would honestly, it's on the bridge between tier 3 and tier 2. So it has some nice toys. They got a new spell card. We're gonna put it in tier 3. I'm gonna put it in tier 3. I think it's a solid okay deck. It can probably win a BCS, or you can definitely top at a BCS. But I don't think it has like the tools to really push it over the edge in terms of like what the healing does. You only heal like 2 a turn, unless, you know, you're healing from an outside follower's perspective, like, you know, either Kaguya or another follower that heals like Frog Cleric or something like that. All right, so next up we have Necrocharge Abyss. So this deck has definitely been slept on. I think Ektar will definitely be able to come back once the Cinderella Girls come out. I think they're going to have some more support for everybody. I've been hearing talks of Cinderella Girls just giving support for a lot of decks. So we'll definitely be doing a tier list for Cinderella Girls too. But as far as set 6, it's definitely taken a back seat, but I will be giving it set 2, or excuse me, tier 2, just because it's still very strong. Ektar is a very strong card, and if you still play those Storm followers or whatever followers that are 2 less that you can get out of your cemetery and get those, you know, stats, if you're at Necrocharge 20, then you definitely prolong the game long enough for you to potentially win. Alrighty, and next up we have PDK Dragon. So the lower end of Dragon, not really with anything too crazy. Of course, we're still gonna be playing Fortes and stuff like that, but if you can establish PDK out on the field and then start using White Frost Dragon, I think you're in a really good position. So I want to give PDK at least tier 2. It really won't be on like the topper end of tier 2. And by the way, disclaimer that these are in no like, you know, chronological order or anything. But I think this deck is tier 2 just because White Frost Dragon is just very good. She's a card that can get out the, you know, spell card that does other things. So I think that those paired up together is pretty nice. So I'd say PDK is tier 2. Alright, and next up we have Gawain. And that's all we really need to talk about Gawain, because I don't even know what this deck does. Alright, so now let's talk about Giant Chimera. So I would say last set, even with Lasheno, I think that that deck was the best version of Rune. Now we have the Big Daddy version of Rune, and I feel like, you know, with my new insight on what Lashena is now, I would say that this deck is definitely number 3 in terms of Rune decks. Now, where I would place it, I think it's still tier 2 because we do have Crimson Meteor Storm. We have other spell cards to do. We're just removing until we can get to Giant Chimera. Yes, it's kind of RNG, but look at RNG for like the lower index, like, you know, Aggro Abyss. Now, it's going to take us longer, of course, but if we're going to be using Mr. Hylian to, you know, pitch 4 off the top 4 of our deck, and then, you know, pitching like a spell card that we don't need to deal 4 damage or something, we're filling up our spell chain. And then we have cards like Saphira that also help too, because we're also milling followers too off of Hylian, if that's also a chance. But you really have to think it's really like a best of 1, so you have to really pray that you don't mill all your Giant Chimeras, because there's no way to get a follower back from the cemetery. Okay, now King Elephant, that is the next deck. So we do have Fairy Forest. That is something that is probably like the stronger version of Forest, but we will get into that description about that when we get to it. But I feel like this is more of the stable version of Forest. If you're going to be playing Forest, this is more of a stable version of Forest that you should be playing. So if you want something that might potentially have a way out, this is one of those decks you should play. So I think this is tier 1.5. It's probably, outside of Amataz, I think it's the best Forest deck. And, you know, you can kill me for it. I'd say you can kill me for it. I think it's a more stable version of Forest. I know with the new Hunters, it has its thing, but I think this is a stabler version of Forest just because we're going to be drawing so many cards. We're able to wipe our opponent's board from cards in hand and an EX area and stuff like that. So I think it's a very strong version of Forest. All right, next up we have Mars, so Officers. So I think this is pretty easy to rank. I think this is a tier 2 deck. I was sitting here like kind of like contemplating to myself whether this was like a tier 1.5 deck with Rami and stuff like that. But I think this deck is too kind of tempo-y. Like, it's kind of just like Tempo Sword. You know, it has its aggressive stuff, and then, you know, you want to play Mars and, you know, hopefully throw Omar of the Stars on her so she can't be attacked unless your opponent plays something with a sail. Then you're kind of like twisting your fingers, figuring out what to do. But I think this deck is tier 2. I think it's pretty solid to take if you want to, you know, like, definitely have like the higher chances of like winning a BCS or something like that. But I don't think it belongs in tier 3 where like those decks can definitely like, those decks are like sliding in like a BCS like top 3 or so, or even winning it if they do. But I think it's a solid tier 2 deck with Rami and stuff like that, and getting your officers out of your deck and giving them +1 attack, and then, you know, Rami buffing herself up and then the board. Alrighty, next up we have Galmu Disdain Dragon. So this was the deck to be playing for Dragons last set. I think it's still a pretty good deck, especially with White Frost Dragon in it. But the one thing that I didn't like about this deck is that you have to ping your followers and they keep that defense. So that means that they're easier to be removed. So I would say this deck is tier 2. Like, I'm being very generous with a lot of these decks, but if I were to really be hard on the deck, I'd say it's tier 3, but I still think it can do a lot of things, especially when we're getting more support in terms of, like, you know, followers that we can play. And, you know, they're not Omen followers, which is sad, but followers that help us, like, stall our opponent out. So I think Galmu is still a tier 2 deck, especially with White Frost Dragon, get the spell out, all that types of stuff. So I think it's a solid tier 2 deck. And next we have Lust Aggro Abyss. So this deck was definitely played aggro. I think it's still very strong. If you replace some legendaries, you know, from the stable aggro Abyss list and just put in like some more Lust stuff, which, you know, a lot of Lust stuff is played in the regular aggro version. So it's, you know, like, what legendary are you playing? Are you playing Valnaric? Are you playing Argavi? Like, you know, what version of Abyss are you playing? So I think this is 1.5. Lust is still 1.5 just because, you know, if you've dealt yourself X amount of damage, you're going to be burning your opponent for X amount of damage, along with swinging with the Valnaric damage too. Alright, so next up we have Heavenly Repost, and man, I feel like there is a lot to talk about and unpack with this deck. So this deck is honestly the counter to Kuon. It's the counter to Kuon because Kuon is going to be setting up. You can drop this card on 4 and you can evolve it by skipping your turn, because if you skip your turn, there's no way Kuon is going to be able to kill you because they are setting up a kill turn. They're just setting up their turns to kill you in the later game. And on turn 4, there's no way. There's no way that deck has stormed you down or at least gotten you into a weird amount of health to where you can't play that card, play your legendary, and evolve it. So I want to put it in tier 2 because it doesn't do well into a lot of decks for sure, but it is the counter to Kuon. So like, it's definitely like almost in the threshold of 1.5. If I had one of those, you know, like those diamond tier list, it definitely would be in a weird place, of course, like between like tier 2 and 1.5. But that deck honestly is the counter to Kuon, and quote me on that. Alright, and next up we have Puppet Forest. So kind of just like with Gawain, I think it needs more support. I mean, we do have a nice little puppet card that really, you know, brings all the puppets together. But, I mean, it's nothing too crazy. So I think it's one of those decks that needs more support for it to really, you know, like flash and be out there. So it's definitely that needs more support. Alright, next up we have Thief Sword. So Thief Sword got another spell card, I believe, in this set, in the terms of like a quick spell. So if you're able to really pair this deck up with everything that it does, the sad thing about this deck is that it helps Kuon. If you hit Kuon off of the top card, you know, that feels good. But Kuon is also another target for Kuon, so they have 2 other targets in there. So that's the number one thing that you really need to be scared of. And then also, You're also sword, so, you know, another deck like, you know, Silent Abyss, where it's tearing your hand apart, well, you're trying to rush your opponent down while they're also shutting down your options, so it's like, okay, where do I really fit in? So, if you're playing a deck that doesn't have like crazy removal, or you're able to like get under them and do what you need to do in terms of like buffing up your followers by getting those 10 cards in Cemetery and then being at full power, then, you know, you're a tier 1.5 deck, just along with, you know, Heavenly Repost. I think this deck is just very strong, but fitting it into the meta will definitely be very weird because it's not the strongest version of Sword, but it is a very, very viable option for Strong Sword. Alrighty, next up we have Mage Rune. So I think I was thinking of a crazy concoction with this deck with Mage Sword, because Rayo is just a very powerful card to just go ahead and look at top 9 and get, you know, 3 or less followers and or spells or amulets, anything 3 or less that you can put into your EX area to be used. So if you can really make this deck work, I say it's a tier 3 deck. I don't think it's anything more than tier 3, just because it's very clunky, because, you know, Rayo's a 7 cost. You can definitely remove a good follower off the field by pitching a mage, but also evolving him in the same turn is very expensive too. So you have to have like a total of 9 play points. And by that time, you know, your opponent either has generated some sort of game plan to beat you, or, you know, you're already in the works of winning. And then next up we have Medusa Gorgons, and this deck needs some more support too. Well, I'm not going to really give a whole bunch of decks that, you know, can be played at a locals level like the gratitude it needs. Like, it needs more support. These cards need more support to really make their archetype like really pop out and just do what these other decks do in like tier 3 and tier 2. Yes, they can function, but their function isn't very strong, so it just needs more support to really make it there. Alright, so let's put on our thinking caps for this next deck, because man oh man, I am having a hard time placing this deck myself. And I know if I put it too high, I'm going to get some crazy backlash on it, but if I put it too low, I'm also going to get some crazy backlash on it. So in the past, we said that this deck was very weird just because, you know, we were leaving a more aggro meta, and, you know, if our opponent had like X amount of cards on the field and then we would do Lashena, it would be like, okay, well, you know, I played Lashena, I didn't do anything on turn 4. Like, I just made 2 cards in the EX area. But, you know, the crackback on Lashena is just very nice. Like, we have Lashena, she's definitely obviously not our top end, but we're going to be dealing damage to our enemy through an amulet, and we're also healing with another amulet too. Yes, it's a bit clunky because we already have 2 cards out of our 5, you know, space, but they generate so much value each turn if your opponent doesn't kill you, and it even makes more value if they didn't do anything to you after you played those cards. So it's really a hand-in-hand thing. So I personally want to put this deck in 1.5 just because of the like power ceiling that it has. Because if you play against this deck, like if you compare this deck to Kuon, it's like, you know, hey, Kuon has like a huge late game. They're going to take 2 turns from you, and if you don't have a huge setup to stop them, you know, it hurts. But with Lashena, on the other hand, you know, you're healing, you're getting outside of your opponent's range, you know, they're going to have to do a lot. And sometimes, you know, they'll have to commit a whole bunch of cards, and if you disrupt those like cards that are being played, then your opponent's like, okay, well, what do I do now? So I would definitely place this deck like very high, like very low tier 1.5. Very low tier 1.5. I know that might be like a hot take for some people. Might be honestly my bias to Rune 2, and I apologize for that. But I think it'd be low 1.5, high tier 2. So, you know, take that into account when, you know, thinking of this deck. Alrighty, next up we have Princess Sword. I know I was sitting there struggling trying to place Lashena Rune, and if you guys, please feel free to flame me in the comments below if you disagree with the Lashena thing. I am open to it. Let's talk about it, guys. But let's talk about Princess Sword now. So I honestly didn't think that this deck did too much starting like last set until I figured out like what was in the list. It's pretty interesting. I'd say it's pretty interesting. If you put this in with Raomi, I think this deck does a lot too, even though Raomi is not a like princess follower or anything. But Princess, you know, Princess Sword with top end being Sequeen Otahime, which I didn't know before. It's not something that's in tier 2, but I think it's a solid tier 3 deck. But moving on, we are certainly getting through this list. So next up we have Gillenese Neutral. So I've never seen like a neutral deck like seriously played or anything, but I do think that this has potential because every set we're getting neutral cards, so that means more things to feed into Gillenese. Before in the last list, I don't think we had Gillenese, and I apologize if you are a Gillenese enjoyer, but we're going to put it in locals right now because there's not really anything besides the, Apostle of Craving and, the Craving Splendor that really synergizes well with Gillenese outside of just having more neutral cards in the deck. So I think it's just a locals level deck. All right, so this is now the placings as of set 6, before talking about the new set 6 decks that are here. So the first set 6 deck we're going to talk about is the Aragavi, so the Beast slash, Pelt Warriors guys. All right, so looking at Beast, so Aragavi is the top end for the deck, so, you have to make sure you see that. But there are other elements that you can use with other Pelt Warriors that are like kind of more aggro effects. So I think this deck, in terms of Beast, is definitely like, bring this to locals, but with, the aggro version of the deck, that's like with 1.5, I would definitely replace the things, but we're just talking about set 6 Beast. So as far as the Beasts are played and everything, like putting in like maybe like Apostles, like Silence and stuff like that for removal, or like Rule and I, or whatever version of the deck you want to make for Abyss, I'd say I'd put it at locals just because the top end is Aragavi for it. But in terms of what like aggro Abyss does, which is in tier 1.5, the aggro version of it, I would say, it's a 1.5 deck. But with just the Beast followers, just being the archetype as it is, I'd say it's a locals level deck. And then moving on into Courtly Dance Sword. So I think in my mind, it's like, do I either want to run Leonidas or do I want to run Courtly Dance? But I think in general, you just want to run both, because when you do Leonidas and then you get that resolve token out and then you do Courtly Dance, all those guys are going to get a buff, and that's what I believe, just because, they're going to be played every time you play a Swordcraft follower, they can get the buff. But there was that instance that I was talking about with Force that, when you play the cards off of the Maga, they don't count towards combo. But I think in my mind, off of the Leonidas resolve token, I'm pretty sure that's how it works, that everybody gets the buff because they are being played. So if I'm incorrect, let me know in the comments below, but I'm pretty sure that's how it's going to work. So I think that paired up with Leonidas is just very strong. So I think this version of Sword, it's definitely just being played, so I think it's a tier 2 deck. It's pretty solid. You can just go ahead and spam out bodies onto the board, and then if you've already done like Leonidas and stuff like that, that makes it even better because they're even bigger to be removed, and they have like a huge stat line. Okay, next up we have Garyu Dragons. So this was definitely the slept on archetype, playing 5 costs or less, dragons for free from the evolve effect of Garyu, and all your dragon followers having ward. But the one thing about this card is that the ward effect is just off of this card. So as soon as you get rid of this card, no longer do the Dragoncraft followers have ward anymore. So they're just engaged followers and they don't have ward. The ward thing has fallen off. So we're definitely going to put this in like tier 3. This is the only way you can get out Shenlong for free, essentially, just from evolving the follower, but it sucks because you can't evolve Shenlong after you've done the evolve effect, so you're kind of in like a weird position there. You want to obviously go for other dragon followers that are 5 or less and stuff like that, but when you do the evolve effect, it uses your evolve for the turn, so it's like, okay, well, what's a 5 cost follower that I can play that, doesn't need to evolve, that can get me some good value off of it. Alrighty, and next up we have Hunter Forest. So personally for me, I have a hard time rating the next couple of decks, but Hunter Forest is pretty solid. I think it's a pretty solid deck. It's not something that needs to be in like low tier 2 or anything, but it definitely is not like a tier 1 deck. So, that's why we have this like secondary tier, just because like these decks can really perform if you put your opponent into like a weird predicament, because you're gonna have so many cards onto the field with this deck. And the fact that Limaga has Storm makes it even better, and then if your opponent doesn't like have like a spell to answer her, they're gonna be trading some followers into like getting rid of her. It just kind of sucks that she doesn't have ward, but I feel like with that, the deck would be even more crazy. But I think this deck is in tier 1.5 just because of Azudia alone. I think with Azudia alone, it makes it like, without Azudia, it makes it like tier 2. But I think if you have Azudia in the deck in the terms of removal, like, somebody plays a follower that's like, does a lot. Well, Azudia just turns him into an amulet, so your opponent now has to spend 2 play points to get that card off to the field, and that stops them from doing, whatever generation of like plays that they were going to do now that they have their follower turned into an amulet. So I think this deck is probably 1.5. Like I said, we can argue about it. So this is really how I see like the meta and everything. So I think this is a tier 1.5 deck for sure. Yeah, so I feel like I've been really like dumpstering on a whole bunch of people's decks. Like, you know, if you enjoy these decks, I welcome you to play them, you know, but we're going to talk in a sense of like, you know, how the archetype is, you know, how does it match up versus like other archetypes that are being played competitively and stuff like that. But moving on into the next deck, let's go ahead and talk about Amata's Forest. So this is definitely a 1.5, like, okay, so I'm putting it at 1.5. This deck is tier 1 when it sees everything on like your opening hand. Like if you see everything and you're just tempoing, you're playing the fairies, you're buffing them, you're able to bounce Amatas after you swing with them and stuff like that. Like everything's going well for you. This deck is tier 1. But I'm going to put in tier 1.5 just because there's the consistency issue. Just like it is for, you know, Aggro Abyss. There's a chance that you don't hit the things that you need to do and stuff like that. Maybe Aggro Abyss has like a more recovery rate and, you know, more consistency rate than like Amata's Forest. But I will say the deck is very strong when it does hit the hands that it needs to. And there's a chance because, you know, Spinaria is a way to help get the Forest Follower and the spell that you need. So I'm going to put in 1.5. I think that's a very solid spot for it. If the deck, you know, falls under just because another deck does better, then, you know, that's what happens. But I think as of right now for set 6, this deck is 1.5. Okay, now moving on into Karula art. So I haven't really seen anything too crazy about this deck. I know Dean just released a video, so go ahead and, you know, check that video out once you guys have the chance to really like understand a deep understanding of the deck. Because I promise to you, I'm not going to give you the best understanding of it. But I was going to release an episode of Inverse Academy to like really understand what this deck did. I played against it a couple of times, but like I'm trying to figure out like what do you really generate by leaving up those play points outside of using your spells. You know, some of them are free, which is cool because you're able to heal and draw cards and stuff like that. But like, you know, what are you really doing when you're leaving out all those play points? Like, you know, you definitely are scaring your opponent, but there's only like a handful amount of Haven spells that you're able to use with, you know, the play points that you have that will really scare your opponent. You know, like you're not using like a Rhyme Wind with the 2 extra play points that you have up, which is one of the, you know, followers effects that you're able to use. So like, you know, what are you really using those play points for? So I think this deck is tier 3. It has like a strong legendary. I think when you have like 6, I think it is like 6 is the most. Like I said, I don't know the most about this deck, but I know that it's pretty strong once it gets going. Like you can, like, I think Haven in general, if you let Haven like just sit around and like do what it needs to do and get into like 8, 9, 10 play points, if it's not Storm, then you're not really gonna have a good time. So it's kind of like the same thing what I was saying with Mage. If you're able to get into the Rayo turn, then, you know, you're in a weird position. Like you really let them get to that point. Like what happened? Did you break that hard? You can't recover? I think, you know, Karula Arts is one of those decks where, you know, if your opponent like generates like more value than you do, which they should because you're not doing it the most that you can with your plays, I think it's a tier 3 deck. So that's probably what I'm gonna leave it as. Alrighty, and next up we have Ward Wilbert. So I just did an Inverse Academy episode about this, so if you don't already know what this deck does, I go into deep depth about what this deck does and what it provides. But we gave this deck a grade C, so you should know it's not hitting nowhere above tier 2, if even getting into tier 2. You know it's going 3 and below. So deck is pretty nice. I think it's pretty cool if you're able to survive and get into, you know, turn 5 with Wilbert, and then Wilbert's able to get his effects by removing wards and stuff like that. Seems pretty cute. So I think this is a bring this mess to locals deck. It's not tier 3 yet just because it doesn't have anything too crazy. Like you're burning your opponent's life through your wards being removed. So yeah, if your opponent's answering your wards, that's nice, but you're only dealing them 1 damage. So I'd say this is just a locals levels deck until we get some more crazy wards that are in Haven. Then, you know, this deck will definitely go up, but as of right now, it's just bring this mess to locals. Alright, so we are now here to talk about it. Let us talk about it. We are at Kuwan. So my take on Kuwan, it is definitely the granddaddy of set 6. Everybody should know that this deck was just very strong. Everyone knew that this deck was going to be the reign of Runecraft, and I am loving it. Loving it. Best version of Runecraft there is right now, you know, with Lashena taking 2nd place and then the Giant Chimera being 3rd, personally for me, you know, outside of, you know, Earthright, you know, the beautiful deck. But we'll talk about Kuwan. Every stage of the game, Kuon is doing something, and they're filtering through their deck while they're doing something. So they're going to see all the cards that they need. They're going to pitch all the cards that they don't want, cards that are going to be in the cemetery, and then, you know, you have Merlins in the deck. So spells that we do throw away, we're going to be using them even more in the game, and we're going to be drawing more cards. And that's what we love, and we're going to summon Kuon X amount of times while summoning a, you know, Shikigami that's going to have Storm, it's going to swing, and we're going to take another turn, and we're going to kill you. And, you know, that's not something that happens in like the first, you know, 6 turns, of course. It's going to take some time for this to happen, but you got to realize that to kill me, you're going to have to use means of either followers, or you're really going to have to burn me, like through followers that aren't being put onto the field. So, and that's even more spells Rune can put into the cemetery. So yes, this deck is tier 1. One of top 3 decks, honestly, with that being, you know, Hand Control Abyss, an aggro version of whatever deck, like that either being like aggro Abyss, or maybe even Sword if it ever gets there, or Egg Haven, whatever you, like, you know, whatever shifts around. I think like top 3 personally for me is Hand Control, Abyss, Kuon, and then aggro Abyss. Top 3 decks in my opinion. Quote me, whatever you guys need to do, but that's my top 3 personally. But yeah, Kuon is a solid deck. Everybody knew that this deck was going to be very good. So if you're playing Kuon today, or, you know, this weekend and stuff like that, best of luck to you. The deck is still slow. It's still a slow deck. It's a Rune deck, but it's going to be generating so much value while it's being slow. So people who are trying to figure out how to counteract this deck, then, you know, by all means, I hope you're able to figure it out. But this is definitely the deck to be beating this weekend. But enough of me glazing Kuon. Let's go ahead and start the next deck, and that is Ralmia. So I don't think there's any really crazy decks that revolve around Ralmia, but I think like if you use Floral Fencer and stuff like that, and then go into Ralmia right after that, I think that's a pretty solid turn. But if we're just talking about like with what Ralmia does, she's just very good because you're swinging for a whole bunch of damage and stuff like that in one turn. So I think she's tier 2, probably tier 3, top of tier 3, honestly, because it's just a solid deck that can evolve and have Storm. And then, you know, that paired up with Floor Fencer, and then maybe, you know, going into an Aurelia and then playing, you know, Ralmia and then evolving, since you have the X amount to make her free, if you're able to do that. So I think that's the huge combo if you're just focusing on Ralmia itself. Alrighty, and then lastly, let's talk about Yokai Abyss. So Gensetsu in itself is just a very good card from playing all those foxes, and they have rush, and then they have ward, and they're doing 2 extra damage. And then when you evolve the Gensetsu, it becomes a 9 defense, so it's even harder for her to be removed. So this deck is very strong if you're using all the control elements in it. Obviously, if it's like the control variant of Abyss, you know, it's going to be the discard package and stuff, and then Gensetsu is one of the big boss monsters. But we're talking about Yokai itself, and I think Yokai itself is just strong too, so I'm going to put it at tier 2. It's a very solid list if you guys haven't seen it. If you guys want me to do a, you know, Yokai Abyss Inverse Academy episode, I will definitely do that. But I think, you know, we'll definitely need some more Yokai stuff. But I think Yokai itself is tier 2. And with Gensetsu just being the top end, it can really do some things too. Because Gensetsu as like a 9 defense on Evo means there's got to be a hard removal card to get rid of her. And then she gets that attack from whatever, you know, Yokai followers get removed in terms of those, you know, token followers that you swing in with. Alrighty, and here is the list finalized. We got through it. Thank you guys so much for being here and watching the video. It means a lot that seeing Shadowverse evolve, because we're seeing so many decks being placed. I remember doing the first one in set 2, and we didn't have, you know, that long of a video, and they were talking for years about like 8 decks or like, you know, 9. But now we're sitting here with like, I think honestly 20 plus decks here. And seeing how some older decks don't really get as much love, but hopefully in the future they can get some support and stuff like that, is very nice. But before we close out, I'm going to talk to everybody at Grand Showdown. If you're watching this video at Grand Showdown, you know, congratulations to getting there safe and everything. Make sure you're safe, you know, leaving the venue and everything, and, you know, conversing with everybody. Just, you know, watch over yourself. You know, make sure you drink some water, guys, because I know you're going to sit there playing and being dehydrated and stuff like that. Make sure you think about your plays and breathe. You know, it's a nervous... when, like, the more you win, the more nervous you get. I know how it gets. But also, please, I said it in the last video, but if you didn't pay attention in the last video, pay attention in this one. Please watch over your stuff. I don't want anything to get stolen. It really sucks for your stuff to get taken by somebody you don't even know. You don't know how to track it and stuff like that. So please watch over your cards and, you know, your backpack and stuff, because there are people with sticky fingers out there. But alrighty guys, that is the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and then comment if you have anything to say to me. I will definitely be answering these comments. I don't know if I've done it in the past, but I will be doing them now, especially for this video, so I can hear you guys' take on a tier list or what needs to be moved around and stuff like that. But make sure you guys are safe in whatever you do tonight and safe whatever you do for the rest of the year. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.
Yeah. TRINN. Just to get you away. What I got to do, what I got to do. Just to get you away. What I got to do, what I got to do. Just to get you away. You pull me too close, now we hesitate.